Story 1. Physically, when I got my first kidney stone, I experienced untold realms of pain. I would not wish that level of pain on my worst enemy. Story 2. Playing football at school as a kid, one classmate kicked me so hard that I fell. Then another classmate, who wasn't even looking, stepped on my face. I got a couple of stitches, but those days felt intense. Story 3. When I was 11, I fell down a set of basement stairs and landed on a concrete floor. My upper back hit the ground before my head, which was probably very fortunate. I don't think I hit any stairs on the way down. It was so steep, just the concrete floor. I had snapped my left collarbone in half when I hit the floor. My parents made me get up with their help and we went to the emergency room. By that point, I was shaking violently and couldn't understand why or make it stop. I couldn't sit. It hurt too much. Standing or lying down were the only positions I could handle. So, I stood in the waiting room until I briefly passed out, and then they found me something to lie on. The fact that pain could make you shake was new to me. I did take advantage of my injury to persuade my parents to let me watch some movies I was generally not allowed to see. I remember Alien and Aliens were on that list. Story 4. Playing football in high school, I had my knee injured by a 285-pound lineman. I tore the anterior cruciate ligament, medial collateral ligament, meniscus, and the patellar tendon. Story 5. When I was struck while riding my motorcycle and slid across the pavement, shredding the skin on my bare arms. I never rode without full gear after that. Story 6. A random pain in my knee one night caused the most hurtful feeling of my life so far. It made me cry from the pain. I have undergone a significant surgery before and often experience strong migraines. Story 7. When I broke my collarbone falling off my bike as a child, it felt like my whole chest was on fire. I couldn't move or breathe properly. I just lay there crying in the dirt. That was my first real experience of pain, and it stuck with me. Story 8. Hemorrhagic stroke and resulting brain bleed occurred immediately after giving birth to my daughter 6 years ago. I know now that what most of us perceive as severe pain is nowhere near the extent of pain our bodies can actually feel. The pain was absolutely incomprehensible. I was certain I was about to die. Thankfully, I am still here to see my kids grow up, but I am now completely and permanently paralyzed on my once dominant right side. I had a great career as a nurse and a promising future, but I lost it all, along with the ability to continue my beloved hobbies. I spiraled into a grueling depression and am trying desperately to see the light at the end. I don't know what hurts worse. My broken heart for not being able to be the mom my kids deserve or the stroke that should have killed me. Yes, it is difficult. Story 9. I don't directly remember this, but I have a vague impression of being in the hospital. When I was a toddler, I had the idea of pouring a kettle full of freshly boiled water over myself. My arm was the only place that scarred, and the scar is about half the length of my forearm. The fact that I have memory impressions about it makes me think it was probably the worst. The most pain I clearly remember was slicing the inside of my esophagus with a fry. It sounds ridiculous, but it was incredibly painful. Story 10. When I was around 4 or 5, my fingers got smashed between the two sides of an extendable dining room table as it was being pushed back together. I was convinced my fingers were going to fall off, but somehow they ended up being okay. It hurt immensely, and it would be years until I felt anything that bad again. Story 11. Depends on what you mean. Physical or mental? Mental was my father's death. Physical was my colon cancer spreading. The only true relief I experienced was when I went into cardiac arrest due to a previously undiagnosed heart condition. Remarkable things happen to really good people. Yes. Story 12. I broke my ankle in kindergarten, but my mom didn't believe it was broken for 3 days, and I was forced to walk on it. Finally, my kindergarten teacher, who was a former nurse, said it wasn't a sprain, and she was right, it was broken. Turns out half of my bone had chipped clean off. Story 13. Breaking my ankle was manageable. The day after having pins and plates inserted, once the nerve blocker wore off, I experienced the most severe pain I have ever felt. I tried to avoid taking painkillers, but it backfired significantly. Story 14. When I had my cesarean section, especially when I left the hospital with its endless supply of pain relief, every slight movement felt like someone was trying to slash me open and gut my insides. Story 15. I experienced pain as a child, but nothing I considered severe. I would say giving birth was different. I have never felt anything like it since. It's as if your soul leaves your body. Story 16. Leaving a friend's house, a pillow had fallen off the couch. I bent over to grab it and tossed it onto the sofa while still bent over. At that moment, my back went out for the first time ever. I couldn't straighten up, and it hurt to walk, bend, or sit. I lay in bed for several days on painkillers and muscle relaxers. This has been a recurring issue every 6 to 12 months for over 20 years. Story 17. When I was younger, I was using a kitchen knife and accidentally cut off my fingertip. It was a terrifying moment. Unfortunately, a couple of years ago, I cut off the same fingertip again. I still cannot feel it to this day. Story 18. Broke my arm. Meh. Got hit by a fully loaded semi-truck. That hurt. First kidney stone. Oh my gosh. Gout. Fainting episode. Story 19. Probably menstrual cramps. There was 1 month when it was so severe that I couldn't even get up. Thankfully, it didn't last long, and I don't normally experience it that way, but it was the first time, as far as I can remember, that I had pain intense enough to make it impossible to get up. Story 20. Aerosinusitis on the plane felt like an ice pick being driven into my skull, and I had no idea what was happening. Story 21. When I was a toddler, I was playing at the top of some steps when I got stung by a wasp on my forehead. I reacted strongly and tumbled down the steps. Fortunately, I escaped with just a few scrapes and a swollen bump on my forehead. Story 22. I almost died on 2 different occasions from pulmonary embolism. I drove to the hospital both times, hunched over the steering wheel, almost unable to breathe from the pain. Story 23. I was shot in my dominant arm, losing feeling in my fingers and requiring a titanium replacement for my bone, which now aches constantly. Story 24. I was in 3rd grade when I fell off my bed onto the open corner of a drawer from my dresser. I landed right on my hip bone, which hurt intensely. I ended up vomiting and then passed out. Story 25. Luckily, I don't really remember it, but I broke both bones in my forearm when I was around 5 years old. I remember the snap and lifting my arm to see it just dangling. I recall my mom screaming and my dad placing my arm on my chest, telling me to hold it there while he carried me to the car. Story 26. I was in the 4th grade when I collided with another kid at recess. We were running in opposite directions. I was looking up at a ball while he was running with his head down. The collision sent me flying. He walked away with a knot on his forehead. I don't remember the impact, but I was told we collided, and I then slammed the back of my head on the pavement. My eye was swollen shut, and I had a fractured cheekbone. I lost 3 teeth. One was found about 6 feet from me, and I ended up with a significant concussion. This was the first of several concussions I would have over the next 10 years. That experience was the first time something like that happened to me, but it was definitely not the worst pain I've ever felt. Story 27. A horse riding accident tore both of my rotator cuffs, broke my jaw, and sprained my hips and spine. For a few seconds immediately after the accident, I didn't feel anything at all, and then the pain flooded my entire body at once. Story 28. I haven't experienced this, but I've heard that breaking your femur, the upper part of your leg, is one of the most painful experiences someone can endure. Story 29. My first quinsy was at 11 years old and again at 24. It was awful, and the treatment of drawing out the pus with a large syringe was not pleasant either. Story 30. I fell off my bike and broke my arm. My mom didn't think it was broken because I could still move my fingers. I had to beg her for hours to go to the emergency room. She felt really bad when she found out it was broken. Story 31. Playing rugby at school, I tackled a lad called Cookie and suffered a testicular torsion. It was worse than anything I have experienced since. I have had toothache, nearly been killed in a motorbike collision, and accidentally bent all the fingernails on my right hand backwards. Nothing comes close. Story 32. When I was a child, I was swarmed by a hive of ground bees. I was stung many times, mostly on my head, as they became tangled in my hair. Story 33. When I flipped off a four-wheeler and hit a horse trailer, I fractured my wrist in 2 places. I didn't go to the hospital for 2 days because I lived in an era where we just had to tough it out. Story 34. I was physically unable to move due to the pain caused by a kidney stone. I had to crawl and drag myself across the floor to get help. I genuinely considered begging for someone to hit me over the head with a shovel until the medication took effect. Story 35. I don't remember all the details, but one time I saw a small tunnel and proceeded headfirst into the light, where I was met by the man in white. Story 36. Waking up after back surgery is by far the worst pain I have ever felt. This includes shattering my tibia and fibula. Now I can no longer use those pain charts at the doctor's office because, compared to the post-surgery pain, everything else feels trivial. Story 37. When my ex broke my heart but insisted that I did nothing wrong and that I was a great person, saying I was exactly what people want in a partner, they left me anyway. Now I can't stop thinking that I am just not good enough. Story 38. Well, this wasn't my first experience with pain. I remember when I was in my first year of school, playing soccer as a goalkeeper. At one point during the match, I went to defend the ball, and it hit my face. It was incredibly painful, so much so that after that day, I never played serious soccer again. Traumas. Story 39. In the early 2000s, I was 11 years old, wearing pink platform slip-on sneakers when I stepped into a hole my dog had dug and tore a ligament. I thought I had broken my ankle after hearing a dreadful cracking sound. Story 40. I partially scalped myself running under a microwave when I was about 4 while chasing my sister. If I cut my hair short, you can still see the scar. Story 41. Menstrual cramps were so severe that I curled up in a ball and cried. They started when I was 11 and lasted through my 20s. Story 42. When I was about 8 or 9, I was riding a scooter down a hill and fell onto a gravel parking lot. Long story short, half of my face was bleeding. Fortunately, I was wearing a helmet. A few months later, I broke my arm twice within a 4-week period. That hurt a lot too. Story 43. When I was 4 years old, my brother accidentally slammed my fingers in the door. I will never forget that moment. The doctor said that at that age, my bones were still like rubber, so they weren't broken, luckily. However, I will always remember the sight of my fingers turning completely blue for a few days while they healed, as well as the pain. Story 44. When I broke both bones in my lower leg while running through a drainage culvert as a teenager, I turned around with my foot stuck in a hole, causing my foot to face backward. Story 45. I don't recall which came first, so I'll tell 2 stories from when I was around 6 or 7 years old. I was watching television on the couch with my legs up in my oversized sleep shirt. I was rocking back and forth and accidentally rolled off the couch like a little egg. My face went straight into the edge of the coffee table, giving me a black eye and chipping a piece of my cheekbone. My parents always hid my birthday presents, wrapped under their bed. I knew this. It wasn't a secret, and I had an irrational fear that someone would steal them while we were out. I would check every time we came home from an outing. One day we were at my grandmother's house and she had a pool. They were throwing their little dog into the pool, which made me sad. So I was comforting her and laying my head on her after getting her out. I smelled like wet dog. When we got home, I ran to my parents' bedroom to check on my presents, and my cat came to play with my hair, which was a common game for us. Well, he smelled wet dog and freaked out, his claws going into my head as he flew backward. At this point, all I felt was coldness on my head, not pain yet. I walked into our living room, where my parents were watching television, and said, "Rascal just scratched me." I looked down at my feet and suddenly blood was pouring from my head. Obviously, my parents and eventually I panicked and rushed me to the hospital. My biggest concern was my dad saying he was going to kill the cat. While they were shaving my head and putting stitches into my 8 lacerations and removing the 4 claws Rascal left behind, I was screaming, "Don't kill my cat. He didn't kill the cat." Rascal went into quarantine for 4 to 6 weeks and was released to us after they determined he wasn't a danger and was likely just startled by the dog's smell. He lived many more years in happiness with our family and remained my best friend. But yes, that hurt a lot. Story 46. When I was 3, I tripped over my mom's coffee and badly burned my foot. I remember screaming while my mom carried me to the car. I didn't need surgery, but my foot required medicine and bandages for a while. Amazingly, there is no scar. My mom still feels bad for setting her mug on the floor. Story 47. Last week, I had an illness caused by the bite of a mosquito, dengue, which is quite common in my country. The pain I felt in all of my muscles and bones was something I never thought could exist. I woke up one afternoon after a nap and found I couldn't move in bed. It was horrible, truly horrible. Story 48. The second time I broke my elbow, which I do not remember from when I was a baby, was from flying off a trampoline at 6 years old. Getting x-rays was the worst experience, as I had to bend my arm while it was broken. Story 49. Emotionally, when I experienced a divorce, I could see in my wife's eyes that she was finished and in love with someone else. There was nothing I could do or say to fix it or convince her to stay. I just cried. It was the most hopeless I have ever felt. Felt like I was watching my entire world disappear before my eyes. Story 50. My first memorable experience was contracting an unidentified gastrointestinal infection and being kept in the hospital overnight due to severe pain. I couldn't stay quiet or still. The waves of pain were so intense that the staff could tell when I was about to experience one because the color would completely drain from my face. The worst part was that, while I was still mobile, I paced up and down the hospital corridor in fear. I decided the only way to get through it was to smash my head against the hospital wall in hopes of being knocked unconscious and unable to feel the pain. I don't remember if I followed through with that plan, but I eventually passed out and came to when my father and a nurse had placed me in a wheelchair. Story 51. I had a severe allergic reaction to antihistamines, resulting in full-body hives, welts, and rashes. My skin could not touch itself without causing pain. In the emergency department, nurses constantly placed their hands on my shoulders to reassure me, but all it did was increase my discomfort. I was fully covered, so they couldn't see the rash until I removed my long sleeves. I wasn't wearing a bra, so I didn't want to strip in the waiting room to prove a point. When I finally showed the doctors my condition, the same nurses who had been touching me immediately turned bright red and rushed out of the room when they realized they had been causing me more pain. I had to take a 3-day course of steroids, and afterwards I spent 2 weeks taking oat milk baths 3 times a day to soothe the rashes. My skin was peeling for weeks afterward. At the same time, I developed tonsillitis for the first time, despite having had a tonsillectomy when I was very young. Closed up my throat to the point where I couldn't eat or drink. I ended up needing 16 liters of fluids through an intravenous line when I was admitted. It was the worst physical pain I've ever experienced. Now, it's quite amusing when I have to tell doctors that I'm allergic to the one thing that helps with allergies. Story 52. My first real migraine made me feel like I was dying. I experienced severe stomach pains that had me lying on the floor of a public restroom. My hernia was quite bad at times. Story 53. Oh my gosh, when I turned 30, it turned out that what my mother said was true. When you reach 30, you will feel everything you have done to your body. Story 54. I had the wind completely knocked out of me while racing my bike across a parking lot. I hit a rock that jolted the front wheel, sending me flying over the handlebars. I remember landing hard. My right breast turned purple and green instantly, and I could barely breathe. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.